A faint cry echoed behind a market alley. Two 6-year-old twin girls followed the sound and found a baby boy wrapped in a blue blanket. They held him, sang to him, and loved him through the night. Never imagining the child they saved was the missing son of one of America's most powerful billionaires. The first pale light of morning slipped quietly through the thin curtains of a small cottage on the edge of Charleston. Inside, Noelle Hart was already awake. She lay still for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of her twin daughters beside her. Ilara and Maisie slept curled together on the mattress, their hands loosely clasped, even in dreams, as if the world felt safer when they held on to each other. Noelle smiled faintly. Then she glanced toward the tiny kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly, almost apologetically. She opened it and paused, studying what little remained inside half a carton of milk, 2 apples, and a small piece of bread wrapped carefully in paper. Enough for breakfast, but not much more. Noelle closed the door gently, taking a quiet breath before turning back toward the girls. "Good morning, sunshine," she whispered. Ilara stirred first. She always did. 2 minutes older than her sister, she carried that tiny difference with a kind of gentle responsibility. "Morning, Mom," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Maisie sat up slowly, her hair a golden tangle. "Is it a sunny day?" she asked hopefully. Noelle looked out the window. "Yes," she said softly. "A very bright one." They ate breakfast together at the small table. Ilara carefully split the bread so that everyone had a piece, while Maisie sliced the apples with serious concentration. Children have a beautiful way of pretending things are enough. Afterward, Noelle knelt beside them. "I may need to look for some cleaning work near the market today," she explained gently. The girls exchanged a glance. "We can help gather bottles," Ilara offered. "Mrs. Bennett at the bakery sometimes gives us bread ends," Maisie added hopefully. Noelle hesitated, then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "but we stay together and we stay where people can see us." The girls smiled. Outside, the city was just beginning to wake. None of them knew that before the sun reached its highest point. Their lives would change forever. The streets of Charleston were warming with the quiet energy of morning. Shopkeepers rolled open their doors. Delivery trucks hummed past old brick buildings. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air as the city slowly came alive. Noelle walked beside her daughters along the sidewalk, holding Maisie's hand, while Ilara carried a small cloth tote. Inside it were a few empty bottles they had collected the day before. It wasn't much, but Ilara carried it carefully, as if it mattered. "Remember our rules," Noelle said gently as they approached the busy market district. Ilara nodded immediately. "Stay together." Maisie added the next one. "Stay where you can see us," and Noelle asked. Both girls answered together. "Ask before we go anywhere." Noelle smiled. Her daughters were young but thoughtful, the kind of children who tried very hard to make life easier for the people they loved. She stopped outside a small boarding house where she hoped to ask about cleaning work. "Wait right here by the bakery alley," she said softly. "I'll only be a minute." The girls nodded. The alley was bright and open, with bakery workers moving in and out carrying trays. Safe, familiar. Ilara set the tote down and began carefully sorting a few bottles near the recycling bin. Maisie wandered only a step away, watching pigeons hop across the pavement. "Look," she whispered. "That one walks funny." Ilara smiled. But then Maisie tilted her head slightly. "Did you hear that?" Ilara paused. Hear what? Maisie listened again. At first there was nothing but city noise, footsteps, traffic, distant voices. Then it came again. A small sound. Soft. Weak. Not quite a cry. More like a tiny voice trying very hard to be heard. Maisie's eyes widened. "Ilara?" She pointed toward a stack of produce crates near the wall. "I think there's a baby." Ilara froze. For a moment she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. The alley was busy enough that sounds bounced strangely between the brick walls, footsteps, carts rolling, the clatter of bakery trays. But then it came again. A fragile, trembling cry. Very small, very real. Maisie stepped closer to the stack of wooden produce crates near the corner of the alley. "Ilara, listen." The sound was clearer now. Not loud, just a soft, uneven whimper like someone trying to call for help, but not having the strength. Ilara's heart began to race. "Wait here," she said carefully. But Maisie had already taken 2 tiny steps forward. Behind the crates, tucked carefully against the wall, sat something unexpected. A baby carrier. It was partly hidden beneath a folded blanket. Ilara's breath caught. "Maisie, don't touch yet." She glanced toward the bakery door. A worker stood nearby, loading trays into a van. Safe. People were close. Then the cry came again. This time the blanket shifted slightly. Maisie gasped softly. "There's really a baby?" Ilara knelt slowly beside the carrier. Inside was a tiny baby boy wrapped in a soft blue blanket. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes squeezed shut as he struggled to cry again. He wasn't hurt, he wasn't dirty, but he looked frightened and very alone. Maisie's eyes filled instantly with tears. "He's cold," she whispered. Ilara hesitated for only a second before gently touching the baby's small hand. The crying stopped. The baby blinked up at her with wide, dark eyes, as if he had been waiting for someone to find him. "Ilara?" Maisie whispered. "What do we do?" Ilara looked toward the bakery door again, then back at the tiny boy, and for the first time that morning, she felt something bigger than fear. "We call Mom," she said quietly, "because sometimes the most important moments in life begin with the smallest cry." Mama Lara called toward the bakery door. Her voice was calm but urgent. Noelle stepped out moments later, wiping her hands on a cloth, expecting a small question about bottles or bread. But the moment she saw the girls kneeling beside the crates, something inside her tightened. What happened? Ilara moved aside slightly. Noelle saw the carrier. Then she saw the baby. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The little boy lay wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his tiny hands curled near his face. His cheeks were pink from crying, but when Noelle leaned closer, his cries softened into small, uncertain whimpers. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. Maisie looked up with wide eyes. Someone left him here. Noelle carefully knelt beside the carrier. Her movements were slow and gentle, the way only someone used to caring for children moves. The baby stirred when she touched the blanket. He wasn't dirty. He wasn't injured. But he was alone. Noelle looked around the alley quickly. Vendors nearby were busy unloading deliveries. No one seemed to recognize the child. "Did you touch anything?" she asked softly. "Just his hand," Ilara admitted. "And he stopped crying," Maisie added. Noelle studied the baby again. The blanket was soft, expensive even. This was clearly someone's loved child, which made the situation even stranger. The baby whimpered again, his tiny face scrunching. Instinct moved faster than thought. Noelle gently lifted him from the carrier. The moment his small body rested against her shoulder, the crying faded. Maisie's voice trembled. "He likes you." Noelle held him close, her mind racing with questions. But in that moment, only one thing mattered. The little boy felt safe. First, she said quietly, "We make sure he's warm. Then we find his family." Noelle wrapped the blue blanket more securely around the baby as she stood. "Let's ask if anyone nearby knows him," she said. The girls followed closely as she spoke with the bakery owner, a delivery driver, and a produce vendor. Everyone shook their heads. One man had seen police cars driving around earlier that morning. "Something about a missing baby," he said thoughtfully. Noelle's heart skipped, but no official information had reached the vendors yet. She looked down at the little boy in her arms. His eyes were open now, wide and curious. The crying had completely stopped. Maisie reached up carefully and touched the baby's tiny fingers. "They're so small," she whispered. Ilara watched closely, protective, even though she barely understood why. "Mom," she said quietly, "what do we do?" Noelle thought quickly. "We'll call the police," she said. "But first we need to make sure he's okay." The morning air was still cool, and the baby was too young to stay outside any longer. "Our house is only a few minutes away," she continued. "We can warm him up and call from there." The girls nodded. As they walked home together, Maisie stayed close to Noelle's side, studying the baby's face with deep fascination. "Do you think he has a name?" she asked. "I'm sure he does," Noelle replied gently. "But right now," Ilara said thoughtfully, "he probably just needs someone." The baby shifted slightly, nestling into the blanket. Maisie smiled. "He found us." Noelle didn't answer, but as she held the tiny boy against her shoulder, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something important had just begun. The Hart cottage was small, but warm. Sunlight spilled through the window as Noelle laid the baby carefully into a padded laundry basket, lined with soft towels. Maisie knelt beside it immediately. "He looks like he's thinking," she whispered. Ilara stood close by, watching every tiny movement the baby made. Noelle warmed a small bottle of milk while keeping one eye on the basket. "Babies this little need to eat often," she explained gently. When she lifted him again, the baby fussed for only a second before drinking eagerly. The girls watched with fascination. "Is he hungry because he cried so much?" Maisie asked. "Probably," Noelle said softly. When the bottle was empty, the baby blinked slowly, looking from one face to another. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not a big laugh, just a tiny, soft curve of his lips. Maisie gasped. "Ilara, did you see that?" Ilara's serious face melted instantly. He smiled. Noelle felt her heart tighten. Even babies this young knew when they were safe. Maisie leaned closer. "Can we give him a nickname until we find his real one?" Noelle hesitated, then nodded slightly. "What were you thinking?" Maisie looked at the sunlight pouring through the window, then back at the baby. "Sonny," she said softly. Ilara considered it. He did come with the morning sun. Noelle smiled gently. "All right," she said. "Sonny it is." The baby stretched his tiny arms, as if approving the name. And in that quiet little cottage, something invisible had already begun to grow. A bond none of them yet understood. The afternoon sunlight stretched quietly across the wooden floor of the small Hart cottage. For a home with so little space, it suddenly felt full. Full of soft whispers, full of curious little voices, and full of a baby who had somehow become the center of everything. Maisie sat cross-legged beside the laundry basket, watching the baby with complete fascination. "Sonny is looking at me," she whispered. Ilara leaned over carefully. "He's not just looking," she said thoughtfully. "He's studying." The baby's dark eyes moved slowly between their faces, as if trying to memorize the two girls who hovered near him like tiny guardians. Noelle folded a towel nearby, watching quietly. "Babies learn by watching," she explained gently. Maisie brightened. "So he's learning us?" Noelle smiled. "Yes," she said softly. "Maybe he is." The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a laugh. Maisie clapped a hand over her mouth in delight. "That means he likes it here." Ilara carefully adjusted the blanket around the baby's tiny shoulders. "We should make sure he stays warm," she said with quiet seriousness. The room was simple, worn furniture, a narrow kitchen, the quiet hum of an aging refrigerator. But around that little basket, something warm and invisible seemed to glow. Noelle watched her daughters closely. They had never cared for a baby before. Yet they moved with instinctive tenderness, gentle voices, slow hands, patient smiles. Maisie leaned closer again. "Do you think his family is looking for him?" The question hung softly in the room. Noelle nodded. I'm sure they are. Ilara looked down at the baby. Well, she said after a moment, until they find him. He's with us. The baby stretched his tiny fingers toward the light. Maisie took that as an answer, and for the rest of the afternoon, 3 children quietly watched over one another in a little house that somehow felt bigger than ever before. As evening settled over Charleston, the cottage grew quieter. The golden light outside slowly faded into soft blue shadows. Inside, the baby began to fuss. It started as a small, restless sound, then a louder cry. Maisie immediately looked worried. Did we do something wrong? No, Noelle said gently as she lifted the baby from the basket. Babies cry sometimes. It's how they talk. She rocked him carefully, but the baby's tiny face stayed scrunched with discomfort. Ilara watched closely. Maybe he's scared, she said softly. Maisie suddenly had an idea. My grandma used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep. Noelle nodded. That's a beautiful idea. Maisie sat beside her mother and began humming quietly. The melody was simple, just a gentle rhythm she barely remembered from years ago. Soft, slow, warm. Almost immediately, something changed. The baby's crying slowed, then stopped. His tiny eyes opened, looking toward Maisie's voice. Ilara's eyebrows lifted. Mom, look. The baby was calm, completely calm. Maisie continued humming, growing a little more confident with each note. She added soft words of her own. Sleep, little sunshine. The night is kind and near. The baby blinked slowly. Then something magical happened. He smiled. A real smile. Maisie gasped in delight, but kept singing. Noelle felt her chest tighten with emotion. Even Ilara's usually serious face softened. The baby's small hand moved gently toward Maisie's voice, as if he knew exactly who was comforting him. When the song ended, the baby had already drifted into peaceful sleep. Maisie looked up proudly. He likes my song. Ilara nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I think he does. But none of them realized that somewhere across the city, a father was desperately searching for the same little boy who had just fallen asleep in their tiny home. Later that evening, the cottage was peaceful. The baby slept quietly in the basket beside the girl's mattress. Maisie and Ilara sat on the floor sharing a book, while Noelle washed dishes in the small kitchen. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one. The old television in the corner hummed softly as it switched from a cooking show to the evening news. At first, no one paid much attention, until the news anchor spoke a sentence that made Noelle freeze. Authorities continue searching for the missing infant son of businessman Reese Calloway. Noelle slowly turned toward the screen. Maisie looked up. Mom. The camera cut to an image, a photograph of a baby, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. The same blanket. Noelle's breath caught. Ilara, she whispered. Both girls turned toward the television. Maisie blinked. That's Sonny. The screen changed again. Now a tall man in a dark suit appeared standing in front of reporters. His expression was calm but strained. Earlier today, the reporter continued, 3-month-old Stellan Calloway disappeared during a transportation incident downtown. His father, billionaire developer Reese Calloway, has asked the public for any information that could help locate the child safely. Maisie's small voice trembled. He has a daddy. Ilara nodded slowly. Yes. Noelle stepped closer to the basket. The baby stirred slightly, still sleeping peacefully. Maisie's eyes filled with tears. Does that mean he's leaving? The room fell silent. Noelle knelt beside her daughters. Her voice was gentle but honest. Yes, she said softly. He belongs with his family. Maisie reached carefully into the basket and touched the baby's tiny hand. But tonight, she whispered, he's still ours. And for a little while longer. The small cottage held a love that would soon have to learn how to say goodbye. Morning arrived far too quickly. Soft sunlight slipped through the small cottage window, touching the laundry basket, where the baby slept peacefully beneath the blue blanket. Maisie was already awake. She sat beside the basket, resting her chin on her hands, quietly watching the tiny rise and fall of the baby's chest. Ilara woke moments later. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at the baby, then at Maisie. Both girls knew what day it was. Noelle entered the room, slowly holding 3 small bowls of oatmeal. "Good morning, my girls." Her voice was gentle, but there was something heavier beneath it. Maisie asked the question first. "Are we taking Sonny to his daddy today?" Noelle knelt beside them. "Yes," she said softly. Ilara nodded. She had already understood the night before. Maisie looked down at the blanket, "But he just got used to us." Noelle gently brushed a strand of hair from Maisie's face. "And his father has been waiting all night to find him." The baby stirred, then opening his eyes. When he saw the girls leaning over the basket, his face lit up with the small smile they had come to love. Maisie's lip trembled. He smiled again. Ilara carefully lifted the baby while Noelle prepared a bottle. They fed him slowly like they had the night before, like they wanted the moment to last forever. After breakfast, Noelle brought out the cleanest clothes they had. "We should all look neat," she said gently. Ilara carefully smoothed the baby's blanket. Maisie held his tiny hand. "Do you think he'll remember us?" she asked quietly. Noelle paused. "Maybe not in the way we remember things," she said. "But babies remember how they feel." Maisie leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead. "Then remember this," she whispered. Ilara wrapped the blanket carefully around him again. The same blue blanket from the alley, now carrying something new. Love. Noelle picked up the baby gently. "All right," she said softly. "Let's go help someone's family become whole again." The girls stood beside her, ready, but not quite brave enough yet. The Charleston Police Department was quieter than the girls expected. The building was tall and serious, but inside it felt calm. Noelle approached the front desk with the baby in her arms. "Good morning," she said politely. "We believe we've found the missing child from the news." Within minutes, Officer Daniel Mercer appeared. He was an older man with kind eyes and a calm voice that made people feel safe. He listened carefully as Noelle explained everything: the alley, the carrier, the blanket, the phone calls she had made. Officer Mercer knelt slightly to look at the baby. "Well now," he said softly. "You look pretty comfortable, young man." Stellan blinked sleepily. Maisie whispered proudly, "He likes it when we sing to him." Mercer smiled. "I can see that he's been very well cared for." He gestured toward a small waiting room. "You did exactly the right thing bringing him here." Ilara asked the question quietly. "Is his dad coming?" Mercer nodded. "He's already on his way." The room suddenly felt much smaller. Maisie's fingers tightened around the edge of the blue blanket. Ilara held the baby carefully, rocking him just a little. Noelle watched both daughters closely. She could see the effort they were making to stay strong. Minutes passed. The clock ticked slowly on the wall. Maisie finally whispered, "Can I sing to him one more time?" Noelle nodded. Maisie began the same gentle melody from the night before. Soft, warm, steady. The baby relaxed instantly in Ilara's arms. Officer Mercer watched the scene quietly from the doorway. Even after years on the job, some moments still surprised him. The door to the hallway opened. Footsteps approached. Maisie's singing slowed. Ilara looked up, and the waiting room grew completely silent. The man who stepped into the room looked exactly like the person from the television. Tall, elegant, controlled. Reese Calloway had the quiet confidence of someone used to being listened to the moment he entered a room. But when his eyes landed on the baby, that confidence cracked. His son was sitting peacefully in the arms of a 6-year-old girl. The second twin stood beside her, and their mother watched protectively nearby. Reese stopped walking. For a moment, no one spoke. Officer Mercer broke the silence. "Mr. Calloway," he said calmly, "this family found your son yesterday morning and kept him safe." Reese stepped forward slowly. His eyes never left the baby. "Stellan." The baby turned his head at the unfamiliar voice. Then he looked back toward Alara. Maisie instinctively hummed the end of her lullaby. The baby relaxed again. Reese noticed. Everything about the room confused him. He had expected reporters, questions, possibly someone demanding a reward. Instead, he found something completely different. A quiet family. 2 children trying very hard not to cry. Reese finally spoke. "You found him," Noelle nodded gently. "In an alley near the market." Reese looked at Alara. "May I?" Alara hesitated only a second before carefully placing the baby into his father's arms. Reese held him tightly. For the first time since the disappearance, his son was back. But Stellan shifted restlessly. His small eyes searched the room until they found the twins again. Maisie stepped forward. "He likes songs," she said softly. Reese looked at her, then at Noelle, then back at the girls. "You took care of him all night." "Yes," Alara answered quietly. Reese took a slow breath, then asked the question that came naturally in his world. "What would you like in return?" Noelle blinked slightly. "Return, yes," he said, "for helping my son." Noelle shook her head gently. "We didn't do it for a reward." Maisie added softly. "We just didn't want him to feel alone." The room fell completely silent. For the first time in years, Reese Calloway had absolutely no idea what to say. For several long seconds after Maisie spoke, no one in the room moved. The police station waiting room, with its pale walls and muted overhead lights, suddenly felt too still, too small, to hold everything that had just been revealed. Reese Calloway stood in the center of it all, his infant son in his arms, staring at the 3 people who had quietly stepped into the darkest hour of his life and asked for nothing in return. Noelle was the first to recover, her hands folded gently in front of her. Not defensive, not timid, just steady. Her face carried the softness of someone exhausted, but also the quiet dignity of a woman who had made peace with doing what was right, even when it hurt. "We only wanted him safe," she said again, her voice low and even. Reese looked down at Stellan. The baby's tiny face was calm for a moment, but his dark eyes kept drifting past his father's shoulder toward the twins, toward Alara, toward Maisie, toward the little world that had held him through the night. That tiny detail landed harder than Reese was prepared for. He had spent the last 24 hours in press calls, security briefings, legal updates, and a private panic so violent it had hollowed him out from the inside. He had imagined this moment 100 times. In every version he found his son, and everything snapped back into place. But nothing had snapped back. His son was here. And yet somehow Reese was standing on the outside of something sacred. Officer Mercer cleared his throat softly, almost as if he hated to interrupt. "Mr. Calloway, I've documented the family's statement," he said. "They cooperated immediately. They contacted us responsibly and brought the child in safely." Reese nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Maisie took a tiny step closer, her hands clasped in front of her dress. Her eyes were red, though she was trying very hard not to let tears fall again. "Can I say goodbye?" she asked in a small voice. Reese looked at her. No one had asked him permission for anything in years without fear in their eyes. But this child wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of losing someone she loved. He swallowed. "Yes," he said quietly. Maisie moved closer and stood on tiptoe just enough to brush her fingertips over the edge of the blue blanket. "Bye, Sonny," she whispered. Then she corrected herself because she was trying to be brave. "Bye, Stellan." Her bottom lip trembled. She kissed 2 fingers and pressed them to the blanket near his tiny shoulder. Thank you for liking my song." Stellan blinked at her, then made a soft little sound, the same kind of breathy coo he had made the night before in Noelle's cottage. The sound undid her. Maisie stepped back quickly and buried her face against Noelle's side. Ilara stood straighter than before, trying to hold herself together with sheer will. She had the grave stillness of a child who understood more than anyone expected and had already decided she would not make this harder for the adults in the room. But her eyes told another story. She looked directly at Stellan, then at Rhys. "He likes to be wrapped a little tighter when he's sleepy," she said. "Not too tight. Just around the sides." Rhys listened. "He likes the bottle warm, but not hot." Ilara continued softly. "And if he gets fussy after feeding, he calms down faster if someone talks to him first before rocking him." Officer Mercer looked away, giving them privacy. Noelle lowered her gaze. Rhys stared at the little girl in front of him, this 6-year-old child calmly handing him instructions on how to comfort his own son. There was no accusation in her voice. That made it worse. Ilara stepped closer and gently touched Stellan's small hand. "When he wakes up, he looks for voices first," she said. "So don't let the room be too quiet." Rhys felt something tight and humiliating twist in his chest. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Ilara nodded, but her composure finally cracked at the edges. "We know he belongs with you," she whispered. She stopped there. Noelle rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Rhys waited. Ilara blinked hard and tried again. "We just wanted him to feel loved until he got home." There it was. No grand speech. No plea. No demand. Just the truth. Rhys looked at Noelle, at the twins, at the cheap shoes on their feet, the carefully washed clothes, the posture of people who had very little and still somehow held themselves with grace. He had met senators, investors, attorneys, diplomats. He had shaken hands with men worth fortunes and women who commanded empires. But in that room under weak fluorescent light, he had never felt smaller in his life. Noelle stepped forward, then gently, respectfully. "You should take him home," she said. The sentence hit all of them at once. Maisie let out a tiny broken sound into her mother's dress. Ilara closed her eyes. Rhys adjusted Stellan in his arms, and for one suspended second the baby looked directly at the twins again, as if trying to understand why the room felt different now. Maisie pulled away from Noelle suddenly. "Wait." She ran to her mother's bag and pulled out the small knit cloth they had wrapped near Stellan's basket the night before, soft, pale, imperfectly folded. She brought it back with both hands. "So he remembers warm things," she said. Noelle inhaled shakily. Rhys accepted it in silence. His fingers brushed the cloth. It was nothing. It was everything. He tucked it beside Stellan, and the baby's small hand curled against it instantly. Noelle saw that and turned away for just a second, gathering herself. Officer Mercer opened the door quietly. Rhys knew this was the moment. He should say something polished, appropriate, grateful, generous. Instead, all that came out was honest. "I don't know how to thank you." Noelle met his eyes. "Then don't thank us with money," she said softly. "Just love him well." The words entered him like a blade. Rhys nodded once, then he left the room carrying his son the blue blanket, and a silence heavy enough to follow him all the way home. Behind him, Maisie finally began to cry openly. Ilara wrapped both arms around her sister, and Noelle stood between them, holding her daughters close, as the room that had briefly contained a miracle became just a room again. But none of their hearts would ever be the same. The drive back to the Calloway estate happened in complete silence. Rhys sat in the rear seat beside Stellan's car carrier, one hand resting near the baby's blanket, the other clenched against his own knee. Outside the tinted window, Charleston passed in long ribbons of afternoon light. Elegant buildings, polished storefronts, manicured sidewalks, the familiar city of influence and order. Normally, it would have soothed him. Today, it all looked strangely hollow. He could still hear Maisie's voice. "Thank you for liking my song." He could still see Alara's face, brave and breaking at the same time. And worst of all, he could still feel the impossible weight of Noel's final words. Just love him well. The black gates of the estate opened automatically. The car glided up the long gravel drive toward the house, a modern palace of glass stone and perfect geometry, perched above the water like something built to impress rather than shelter. It had won architectural awards. It had been featured in magazines. People called it breathtaking. As Reese stepped inside carrying his son, it felt cold. Not physically cold, emotionally cold. Every sound echoed. The marble floors reflected pale afternoon light. The living room stretched out in immaculate symmetry. Art lined the walls. Sculptures stood motionless on pedestals. The entire home radiated wealth, taste, and control. And yet the moment Stellan opened his eyes inside it, he began to fuss. At first it was small, a wrinkle of the face, a restless kick beneath the blanket, a sharp, uncertain noise. Reese unbuckled him from the carrier and lifted him quickly. "It's all right," he murmured. He was not used to saying things like that aloud. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. Stellan whimpered harder. A housekeeper appeared silently at the edge of the room. "Would you like me to call the pediatric nurse?" Sir Reese almost said yes. Almost handed the whole moment over to someone more practiced, more trained, more capable of handling a child who had just returned from a traumatic separation. But then he remembered Alara's face. "He looks for voices first." "No," Reese said quietly. "I'll take him upstairs." The nursery was enormous, too enormous. Its soft blue walls, custom rocking chair, imported crib, and carefully curated shelves had been assembled by professionals months before Stellan was born. Everything was flawless, beautiful, ready. Yet the room had never felt lived in. Reese walked slowly with the baby in his arms. "It's your room," he said, almost apologetically. Stellan cried harder. Reese checked the bottle schedule. He prepared formula exactly as instructed. The baby took a little, then turned away. Reese changed him. He rocked him. He walked. He adjusted the blanket. He dimmed the lights. He even asked one of the staff to play soft instrumental lullabies through the hidden speaker system. Nothing worked. The crying continued, thin at first, then desperate. Reese stood in the center of the nursery, his expensive shirt wrinkling under the baby's twisting little body, and felt something close to panic rise in his throat. "What do you need?" he asked. He wasn't angry, just lost. The question landed in the air and came back to him unanswered. Then, like a flicker of memory through fog, he heard it again in his mind. Maisie humming. Simple, uneven, tender. Reese sat down in the rocking chair with Stellan against his chest. He tried to hum. The first sound that came out was awkward and low, stripped of melody. He stopped, almost embarrassed, though no one else was there. He tried again. This time softer. No real tune. Just presence. Stellan's crying didn't stop completely, but it changed. It faltered, became uncertain. Reese kept going. He did not know the song, but he remembered the feeling of it: warmth, repetition, patience. Not performance, not perfection, just comfort. So he gave the baby the only thing he knew how to offer in that moment: his honest attempt. Gradually, the crying slowed. Stellan's breathing hitched once, twice. Then at last he quieted. Reese looked down in disbelief. The baby's cheek rested against his shirt. One tiny hand had drifted toward the small knit cloth Maisie had sent with him. Reese stared at it. That little cloth looked absurd against the elegance of the nursery. Handmade, uneven, humble. It belonged nowhere in this room, and yet it was the only thing in the room that seemed to matter. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for 1 second. The silence that followed did not feel victorious. It felt exposing. Because now that Stellan was calm, there was no distraction left. No crying to solve. No task to perform. No movement to hide behind. Only truth. Rhys opened his eyes and looked around the nursery. The crib had never been slept in. The armchair had barely been used. The books on the shelf had never been read aloud. The mobile above the crib turned gently in conditioned air, decorative and untouched. He had built an ideal environment for a child. But not a life. Not warmth. Not memory. Not attachment. He had prepared a place for Stellan to exist. Noelle and the girls had given him a place to belong. The realization hit with humiliating precision. Rhys lowered his gaze to his son. "They knew what you needed," he whispered. The words hurt because they were true. The baby shifted in sleep calm, now trusting now, but not because of the estate. Not because of the nursery. Not because of Rhys. Because somewhere in the last day, a little cottage with worn floors and warm voices had taught him that the world could be gentle. Rhys sat there long after the sun had gone down. The mansion remained immaculate around him. Perfectly lit. Perfectly ordered. Perfectly empty. And for the first time in his adult life, Rhys Calloway understood that a house could contain everything money could buy and still be missing the one thing a baby recognized instantly. A soul. Rhys did not sleep. The house slept around him, or at least pretended to. Staff moved in distant hallways with practiced quiet. Security lights glowed outside the long windows facing the water. The tide shifted beyond the glass. Somewhere below, a clock marked each passing hour with a soft, measured click. But in the nursery, time had become something else entirely. Rhys sat in the chair beside the crib jacket, discarded sleeves, rolled tie gone, staring at the baby monitor, even though Stellan was only a few feet away. The child slept restlessly. Not crying now, but unsettled. Every so often he would shift under the blanket, his tiny brow tightening, before relaxing again, as if searching in dreams for voices that were no longer there. Rhys knew whose voices those were. He stood and walked quietly to the crib. Stellan was sleeping with one hand resting on the small knit cloth Maisie had given him. The sight of that tiny fist holding on to something handmade and ordinary in a room built by luxury made Rhys feel exposed in some primitive, inescapable way. He had spent years mastering distance. Distance in negotiations. Distance in grief. Distance in every relationship that required more than polished efficiency. Since his wife's death, he had become even more controlled, more self-contained, more allergic to emotional disorder. He had convinced himself that structure was strength, that precision was protection, that providing well was the same thing as loving well. Now a 3-month-old baby sleeping in imported linen was undoing all of it. Rhys left the nursery and walked the halls barefoot, something he almost never did. The floor was cold beneath his feet. He moved from room to room as if seeing the house for the first time. The dining room, enormous, elegant, almost never used. The formal sitting room, all angles and silence. The study lined with books, reports, awards, and documents worth millions. He poured himself a drink in the dark kitchen, then stopped before lifting the glass. No. It would only blur what he suddenly needed to see clearly. He set it down untouched. His reflection stared back at him in the black window over the sink. Not the commanding businessman from magazine covers, not the composed widower people spoke of with careful respect, but a tired man who had just realized he did not know how to soothe his own son. The humiliation of it should have made him defensive. Instead, it made him honest. He went back to the nursery and sat on the floor this time, leaning against the crib like a man who had run out of polished surfaces to hide behind. Stellan stirred and made a soft sound in his sleep. Rhys looked up. "I almost paid them," he said quietly into the dim room. The truth of it sat between him and the child like an accusation. Not because he was cruel, because payment was the only language he had trusted for years. Need a problem solved, fund it. Need loyalty, compensate it. Need gratitude, reward it. He had walked into that police station, expecting the world to behave the way it always had around him, transactional, predictable, measurable. But Noel Hart had looked him in the eye and refused to turn goodness into a price. The twins had cried for his son and still let him go. And in a single afternoon, they had shown him the poverty of his own emotional life more clearly than all his wealth ever had. A quiet knock came at the nursery door. Johnson, his longtime executive assistant, stood there, hesitant. "Sir, I apologize for the hour. I only wanted to confirm tomorrow's press statement." Reese stared at him for a second, as if the question came from another world. "What statement?" "The one thanking the public, sir. The recovery update. We've drafted language for media release along with revised talking points about family privacy." Reese looked at the man who had worked beside him for 12 years and suddenly heard the machinery of his life clicking back into place, efficient and soulless. Talking points, media release, family privacy, as if today had been a branding event. "No statement tonight," Reese said. Johnson blinked. "Very good, sir." And Johnson, "Yes, sir, I need information." On the incident number, Reese glanced toward the crib. "On the family who found him." Johnson paused, surprised. Reese continued before the man could ask. "The mother's name is Noel Hart. Her daughters are Ilara and Maisie. I want to know where they live, what kind of support they have, whether the girls are in school, whether they're safe, what they need." Johnson's expression shifted carefully into neutral professionalism. "Of course, sir," discreetly Reese added. "No pressure, no contact yet." "Yes, sir." Johnson hesitated again, then said, "May I ask if there is a concern?" Reese looked at the crib. "Yes," he said after a long moment. "Mine." Johnson did not understand, but he nodded and left. The room fell quiet again. Reese sat there for a while longer, his forearms resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child. When Stellan began to stir once more, Reese stood and lifted him from the crib before the crying could fully start. This time he did not rush, did not call for help, did not try to fix the moment. He simply held him. "You were loved before I got you back," Reese whispered. Stellan settled slowly against his chest. Reese closed his eyes. The sentence kept unfolding inside him, not as insult, as revelation. His son had spent one night in a small cottage with a woman who had almost nothing, 2 little girls with soft songs and careful hands, and somehow that place had given the baby more felt safety than this vast estate had managed in all its perfection. That truth could have broken him. Instead, it began to remake him. By dawn, Reese was still in the chair by the window, Stellan asleep in his arms, the first pale light of morning entering the nursery exactly the way it had entered Noel's cottage the day before. Different house, same son. And for the first time in years, Reese Calloway did not want power distance or control. He wanted to become the kind of man his son could trust. The kind of man those little girls had somehow believed he still might be. And somewhere deep inside that sleepless, aching dawn, the first real change began. By late morning, the Calloway estate was awake again. Phones rang in distant offices. Staff moved quietly through polished hallways. The world Reese Calloway controlled had resumed its usual rhythm. But Reese himself had not. He stood in the large window of his study staring out across the calm harbor water while holding the report Johnson had quietly delivered. The folder was thin. Inside were only a few pages, yet each line felt heavier than the last. Name Noel Hart, age 31, children Ilara Hart, 6, Maisie Hart, 6, occupation temporary cleaning work and occasional hospitality shifts. Reese read slowly. The report described a small rental cottage on the western edge of the city. The twins were not yet enrolled in a formal private school, but neighbors described them as bright, respectful, and unusually thoughtful children. They often helped local shop owners tidy outside areas or collect recyclables in exchange for small tips or leftover bread. Reese stopped reading for a moment, not because the information shocked him, but because of what it revealed. They had very little, yet when they found his son, they hadn't asked a single question about reward money. They had simply protected him. Reese turned another page. The final line of the report read, "Community reputation, honest, kind family. Never known to ask for help." Reese closed the folder slowly. For years he had met people who approached him with business proposals, investments, negotiations, expectations. Everyone always wanted something, but not them. They had taken his child into their home, warmed him, fed him, soothed him, and then quietly returned him. Reese looked toward the nursery. Stellan was sleeping peacefully now. A small knit cloth rested beside him in the crib. Reese picked it up. The soft fabric carried the faint scent of soap and something warm he couldn't quite name. Home. Reese stared at it for a long moment. Then he made a decision. "Johnson," he said quietly into the intercom. "Yes, sir, I'm going out." Reese rarely drove himself anywhere, but that afternoon he did. He left the estate in a simple car without security or assistance. The drive took him through neighborhoods he had only ever passed quickly on the way to business meetings. The streets became narrower, the houses smaller, paint faded, gardens uneven, sidewalks cracked in places. None of it looked hopeless, just overlooked. Reese slowed the car as he reached the address Johnson had provided. A small white cottage stood at the corner of a quiet street. The roof was worn but carefully maintained. A small flower pot sat beside the front step. 2 bicycles leaned against the fence. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere nearby. Reese stepped out of the car. For a moment he simply stood there, uncertain. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, but knocking on this door suddenly felt strangely difficult. He raised his hand. Knock. Footsteps moved quickly inside. The door opened. Alara stood there. She blinked once in surprise. "Mr. Calloway." Her voice was polite but calm. Reese felt unexpectedly relieved. "Hello, Alara." Maisie appeared beside her almost instantly. Her face lit up. "Is Stellan okay?" Reese nodded. "He's doing well." Noelle stepped into view from the kitchen area, wiping her hands on a small towel. Her eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Calloway, we weren't expecting you." Reese glanced inside the cottage. The room was small. Simple furniture, worn wooden floors, a narrow table with 3 chairs. But everything was clean, carefully arranged, and warm. He looked back at Noelle. "I hope I'm not intruding." Noelle hesitated for only a moment, then she opened the door wider. "Please come in." Reese stepped inside the cottage slowly. The entire living space was smaller than his study at the estate. Yet something about the room felt alive in a way his mansion never had. A hand-drawn picture hung on the wall, 2 stick-figure girls holding hands beside a bright yellow sun. Maisie noticed Reese looking at it. "That's Sonny," she explained proudly, "before we knew his real name." Reese felt something tighten in his chest. Noelle offered him the only chair near the small table. "I'm sorry we don't have much space." Reese shook his head gently. "It's more than enough." The twins sat nearby on the floor. Maisie studied him with open curiosity. "Did Sonny sleep okay?" Reese paused. He cried a little. Alara nodded knowingly. "He likes voices." Reese almost smiled. "Yes," he said quietly. "I noticed that." The room fell into a comfortable silence. For the first time since the crisis began, Reese felt strangely calm. Not because the situation was resolved, but because he was finally seeing something clearly. The twins sat close to each other without thinking. Noelle moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing tea for a guest she had never expected to host. There was no performance here, no ambition, No negotiation. Just a family. Reese looked at Noelle. I came to thank you properly. Noelle shook her head. You already did. No, Reese said softly. I didn't. He glanced at the girls, then back at their mother. You gave my son something I didn't even realize he needed. Noelle's expression softened. What was that? Reese looked around the small cottage once more, then answered with complete honesty. A home. The afternoon light in the small cottage softened as the conversation slowly settled. Reese sat quietly for a moment, looking at the twins, and then at Noelle. He had prepared speeches before for investors, reporters, charity boards, but this was different. Carefully, he placed a small folder on the table. I hope you'll let me do something, he said. Noelle frowned slightly. You've already said thank you. Reese shook his head. This isn't a payment, he explained calmly. And it's not charity. Ilara and Maisie looked at the folder with curious eyes. Reese continued. It's an opportunity. He opened the folder and slid a document across the table. Inside was the lease to a small home in a quiet neighborhood, not far from a public elementary school. 3 bedrooms, a safe yard, reliable utilities. Noelle stared at the paper, stunned. I can't accept something like this. Reese leaned forward slightly. Yes, you can, he said gently. Because this isn't about what you did for me. It's about what your daughters deserve. The twins looked at each other. Maisie whispered, a yard, Reese smiled. And a good school. Ilara looked up slowly. You mean, we could study there? Yes, Reese said, if you want to. The room went very quiet again. Noelle wiped her eyes quickly. For them, she said softly. Then she nodded. All right. A few days later, the Hart family stood in front of a small blue house at the end of a tree-lined street. The windows were bright. A white fence surrounded a tiny garden. Maisie pressed both hands to her mouth. Is this really ours? Reese handed the key to Noelle. You should open it. Noelle's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the door. Inside, sunlight filled the living room. The space was simple but warm. A couch, a bookshelf, a kitchen that actually had room to move. Ilara walked slowly down the hallway. There are 2 bedrooms. Maisie ran to the back window. There's a yard. Her laughter filled the house like music. Noelle stood quietly in the doorway, overwhelmed. Reese noticed. You built something beautiful already, he said softly. She looked confused. In your cottage. The love there. That's what made this possible. Later that afternoon, Reese returned with Stellan in his arms. The moment the twins saw him, their faces lit up. Sonny Stellan's eyes widened. He kicked his feet excitedly and reached toward them. Maisie laughed. He remembers. Reese watched as the girls carefully held the baby again. Stellan relaxed instantly. His small fingers curled around the familiar knit cloth, and for the first time since the crisis began, everyone in the room felt completely at peace. Life slowly found a new rhythm. The twins began school that autumn. Ilara discovered she loved science and reading. Maisie filled notebooks with drawings of sunshine houses and smiling babies. Noelle started working again, this time managing guest services at one of Reese's community properties. But what changed most was something no one could measure. Every Sunday afternoon, a familiar car pulled up in front of the blue house. Reese would step out, and in his arms would be Stellan. The twins always ran to the door first. Sonny's here. Stellan grew quickly. Soon he learned to crawl, then to walk. And his first clear word surprised everyone. He pointed at the twins and said, "Sis." Reese laughed harder than anyone had ever seen him laugh. Years later, the connection remained just as strong. Ilara grew into a brilliant young doctor. Maisie became an art teacher who filled classrooms with color and kindness. Noelle helped families facing difficult times, always remembering how easily life could change. And Reese Calloway. He became a different man. Not because he lost his wealth, but because he finally understood what wealth could never buy. One quiet Sunday evening, as the sun set over the backyard, Reese watched the grown twins laughing with Stellan. He turned to Noelle. "You gave my son something priceless," he said. She smiled gently. "We only gave him love." Reese nodded, and for once in his life, he knew that was more than enough. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next